So the issue I will be discussing is the topic of federal, or United States specifically, federal farm subsidies. A subsidy is money given by the government without expectation of repayment. In the agricultural subsidy world, there are several types of subsidies given to farms, such as insurance, where the government steps in and helps farmers pay their insurance premiums; price fixing, where if the market price of a specific crop drops below a certain amount, the government will step in and pay the difference; and disaster aid, in which the federal government will, in the event of a disaster, help the farms rebuild themselves. Now, during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl is when these subsidies started to form. So imagine you're a farmer and people are cutting the spending in every area, including food. And the Dust Bowl has made your yield not so high, so you go out of business. And then after that, after the Great Depression ends, Dust Bowl ends, the United States would have kind of a problem where there's not enough farms because a lot of them went out of business. So during that time, these policies were enacted, and since then they've actually increased the amount of aid the government's been giving, even though, well, I'll touch on it later, but it's becoming less and less necessary. So I'm here to argue that today, in this era, that these subsidies are harmful to the farming industry, to the environment, and to the taxpayer. Now, one way that they are harmful to the farming industry is they harm competitiveness. There is a disproportionate amount of aid given to farmers. For example, the government gives, actually I'm going to quote a source here, agricultural policy researcher Darren Bass pointed out that even though small family farms made up 89.9% of all farms, they only received 27% of so-called commodity payments and 17% of crop insurance payments. Commodity payments are part of the price fixing that the government does. And then another issue that shows that the small farmers are failing to compete with these large farms that the government is helping to create is that the USDA actually released data that showed that the number of farms went down from 7 million in 1935 to just 2 million in 2018. But at the same time, the average farm size has increased from about 150 acres to 430 acres. So instead of having a lot of smaller farms that are able to compete with each other, we're starting to get fewer and fewer farms that are growing larger and larger, which leaves little room for competition. Subsidies, because the land, this increases land demand, these subsidies do, which in turn increases the amount of land that people are using, which increases the prices of land. Economist Brian Riedel stated that economists estimate that subsidies inflate the value of farmland by 30%. High farmland prices make starting a farm prohibitively expensive for younger people who would have other expenses, including buying expensive equipment, seeds, and pesticides. Now, speaking of pesticides, that brings us to the point where subsidies are harmful to the environment. Subsidies encourage farmers to expand their farms and use more land because they're given subsidized insurance, which encourages them to take more risks. The USDA said that because of these subsidies, or increased crop insurance subsidies in the mid-1990s, motivated farmers to expand cultivated cropland area into the contiguous 48 states by an estimated 2.5 million acres. And the other issue is that the land that they're using is not necessarily high-quality land, since the prices are fixed, so farmers are not too concerned about the yields they're getting. They don't really care as much. They'll plant as much as they can to get as much money as they can. And the USDA also said that, the land use change increased annual wind and water erosion by an estimated 1.4 and 0.9% as of 1997. So because we're using this low-quality land, we're actually eroding it and making it worse. But this doesn't really harm the farmers because their profits are subsidized and they have insurance. And subsidies are harmful to the taxpayer because, according to the USDA again, $24.6 billion was spent on role of subsidies in 2017. And that is a lot of money going towards this. We have to ask ourselves if it's really worth it for us to be paying for all of this. And part of the issue is that farmers are not poor. According to the USDA, median farm household income is forecast to reach $76,594 in 2018, which is not really, so they're kind of making this image of the poor farmer, when really that's not the case. We're subsidizing the middle class, which doesn't really make sense. And also evidence that ending subsidization would not be dangerous to the industry is in New Zealand. In 1984, New Zealand ended its subsidies and the farming industry thrived. Economist Chris Edwards explained that the changes were initially met with resistance, but New Zealand farm productivity, earnings, and output rose in the years after reform. And my final piece of evidence that it would be easy for us to save these taxpayer dollars is that subsidies are not necessary because of the existence of other industries. There are many other industries out there that don't need these subsidies. Why does this one in particular need it? So those were my points to highlight that subsidies are harmful to the environment, the taxpayer, and the farming industry.
Right. It's a little awkward because the proposition contains the preview simultaneously, and generally you want to separate those, but I knew what your argument was at the beginning, and there is a preview of what the supporting points are going to be. Like I said, it just has a tendency to run together. In the body of the speech, you have a background explanation about how the subsidies originated and what their purpose and function is. There's not really much discussion about how important they were to accomplishing those things. You're just suggesting that in contemporary times they are much less significant, and for a variety of reasons. And I think you generally explained those pretty well. There's some good data about the percentage of farms that receive aid and how it doesn't really go, most of the aid doesn't really go to the small farms, which is a little inconsistent with your later argument suggesting that all these small farmers don't really need the aid. Well, apparently they're not getting most of the aid. Most of the aid's going to the bigger farms. So I'm not exactly sure that there's consistency between the first and the third argument on that point. The decline in the number of farms is okay, although the number of acres being farmed has increased substantially, and the yields apparently have increased. I don't know that you are trying to attribute that to subsidies. There may be other things that explain why there's been a change in the number of farms and their productivity. You seem to be trying to tie it into the subsidies, and in a couple of places I can see a relationship, but in other places I'm not sure that you've developed that as much as you could. The link to the environment, for instance, on that second point, it basically comes down to the notion that the farmers doing this don't have to worry about yield, so they exploit land that is already low yield, and that's going to create erosion problems. That's not really quantified. There's a big presupposition built in there. To me, that was the argument that was developed the least. The first and the third arguments are the ones that are developed the most and have the best evidence on it. The third point is pretty straightforward. It's, how much money do we spend on these things? Now the question is there an economic benefit to having this? For example, does that control prices and make food more affordable? I don't know. That might be one of the arguments that's made by people who are advocates of these particular policies. When you compare the absence of any particular harm to a place like New Zealand, I think that's a good piece of argument to be making. The closer you could show that the subsidies that existed in New Zealand were similar to the ones that exist here, the better off you would be on those points. I thought you did a good job citing all of your evidence. You're very consistent about doing that. Your explanations are usually clear, and you do a good job speaking to the audience as well. All right, thank you.